Now hit the record button on the iPhone.
The red one?
Yep. Yep, and it's recording over there too. Cyberfight is planned to be a part of a series of unrelated short films that are largely academic in nature. The project started largely as an opportunity to explore virtual production, both for the Alex Theatre and for SAE Institute, whilst also giving myself and my friends some interesting material for our show reels and portfolios. By extension, this making of is sort of my reflective documentation as much as anything. For some context for anyone not aware, virtual production is a pretty new film workflow, and it's a bit of an umbrella term that broadly refers to filming in a physical set and a virtual set simultaneously. That brings your sort of CG set extension into the pipeline earlier, and you're actually able to see and interact with this while you're shooting. This can be using green screen, like I'm sort of doing now, or LED screens like we do on the film. Both of those workflows are totally valid, and they both have pros and cons to them. The short version is that LED screens are very cost prohibitive, but they give you a lot of control and consistency with your lighting and your reflections that you can't get with green screen, whilst also introducing a whole bunch of camera issues that you have to try and navigate. I started getting into virtual production through working in Unreal, and by sheer luck, getting involved with a startup operating out of the Alex Theatre, initially as an environment artist, before moving on to working on some of my own productions. I'm also a games lecturer at SAE Institute, and I've started to bring virtual production into the classroom because whilst it is a film workflow, it's using primarily games, tools, and processes. All right. So just tell us about the configuration, I guess.
We're in a production in St Kilda. We've set up at Alex Theatre, we've partnered up with the studio. They've given us this space, we've used as much as we can, so we put a main screen down the back behind me that you see behind me. That's a P3 screen, it's very high resolution. P3 means it's pitch, which means the pixels are very close together. That wall from one side to the other is 11.5 metres wide and it's 4K. 3,840 pixels across. Now that wall gives you a lot to work on. It means that if you've got a 24 or 35mm lens, you can push back a good 10 metres and still frame up. You can have plenty of sky up there, or in this case, in this environment, plenty of sea up there. So that's our in-camera screen. It allows a lot of movement back and forwards. We could probably do up to 20 people here, 20 subjects, and could be shot on a nice wide angle and still catch it all. What we then have, this screen's a high res. The one behind me is very high res. It's lightweight, because we also use it for events. It hits about 1150 nits, which is brightness. By comparison, a home domestic TV might be 150 to 200 nits. So it's roughly 5 times the brightness. Spinning around on the other side of the studio, we've got a roof. We've hung as much as we can in the roof. We're only allowed 450 kilos, so that the screen plus all the rigging was the limit of the roof, otherwise we would have gone bigger. And then we've got all the other screens as part of the light source. A lot of them are rolling risers, depending on whether we need to bring them in or bring them out, depending on what the DOP wants on the day. So we want to be able to do, generally speaking, we've found 80 to 90% of the lighting has been done using the LED screens as a light source. Okay, so going back to the main background screen, none of that's in camera. It's all a light source. It's a P3.9, so it's not quite as high a resolution. That's pretty irrelevant. It's never in camera, you never see it. It's an outdoor screen, which means it's 4 times as bright. It's also waterproof, but we don't plan on having it raining inside. But the fact that it hits about 4,500 nits, 4,500, maybe 5,000 nits. So it's about 4 to 5 times, 4.5 times as bright as the in-camera high-res screen. It's so damn bright in here. Everyone's wearing hats and sunglasses to shoot that day. The surround background screen, this guy here, that's just the colour, that's the light source. That's roughly about 4K as well. It's more screen, I think it ends up being about 16 meters or 17 meters, but it's not quite as high resolution, so it ends up being 4K as well. So we're running dual 4K. The computers we run off these are two computers that cost about 10 grand a piece. They're both running 3090 GPUs side by side. They're identical machines. So that's our resolutions on them. One side's running 4K, so it's a dual 4K we're running, and then in the studio, those computers run outside, just in the next room. We have our workstation here in the studio. Final thing I'd mention is power. LED screens are all modular. They're sort of about a 500 by 500 size, and you can put them together in any shape or form your little heart desires. We're running about 750 panels here at a guess. I can't remember exactly, but it's about that number, and each panel draws about 1 amp at full white. So when they're on full brightness, full white, they draw up to 1 amp. So we need about 750 amps in here, which is about a whole street's worth of power. You can hear there's a little bit of echo in the room, but we do have a lot of curtains, and we'll pull them across. They're all drawn at the moment. So that's sort of, it's not a sound stage, but it's not too far off it. It's not too bad. This is the fun thing. Everyone wants to know what it costs. About $1 million. The panels are about $1,100 a piece. So multiply that out by 750, add some computers, add all the rigging, add all the hardware, cameras, you're getting up to about $1 million. So this is a starting point. This studio is a little bit bigger than most of the ones we see online. There's a lot of them popping up on social media. The socials are showing lots of people in Czechoslovakia to Israel to Johannesburg. These things are popping up everywhere. There's got to be at least a dozen in LA, even though they're in lockdown. So this is probably about 3 to 4 times the size of most ones we're seeing pop up. However, so we are 11.5 meters wide. By comparison, the Mandalorian was 22 meters wide. We're 5.2 meters high. Mandalorian was 6.4 meters high. So they're probably 4 times the size of us. Not many companies have enough screens. These things are expensive. They need to run at a very high refresh rate. They need to have a very good contrast. They need to be running 16-bit color space. And as I said, the LED screens are about 500 by 500 panels, about $1,100 a panel. But that gives you an idea. We're looking at about $1 million setup here. Most other setups are maybe 200 grand's worth of gear, and that sort of gets you up and going with a small little studio for a bit of fun. So when we put the screens up, there's a great deal of rigging required. The weight of the screens is a big problem. So you take a television screen and then multiply it out and make it 11.5 meters wide, 5.2 meters high. This guy here weighs over a ton, what you're looking at there, and it's got to sit there suspended in space. So we have a whole bunch of rigging behind it to keep it all safe, and all the ballast to counterweight it. Engineers have signed off on everything here, but putting all this stuff up is really it's a very tricky engineering challenge to build like this. When we embarked on this little project, I brought in a whole bunch of different people and to collaborate together, from filmmakers to people who'd worked with Unreal and other gaming side of things, to a bunch of event people who know how to set all the screens up, which is my background. And we're 3 industries who have never really worked together, and we had to figure out how to communicate and how to interlock and seamlessly find a way of working together. You have a bunch of problems on the day. Screens are playing up, tracking's playing up. Who's going to deal with it? Who's got the environment's playing up? But the environment's playing, we've got problems on the screen. Where's it coming from? And so there's no primary sort of organized or side to it. It's really 3 completely different industries who are having to collaborate and integrate together. And I've never really done it before. We're all having fun doing it, but it's presented a lot of technical challenges, as you might imagine.
Why won't that load? Compiling shaders. So the environment for the shoot was made in Unreal. We started with a template which was made based on the screen setup. So we have this mesh here actually represents the screens themselves. So we knew that where whatever would be on the other side of this screen would be what we were shooting against. And it has as well in it a bunch of different cameras which control things like the focus tracker, as well as a system for creating our light cards, so we can move them around. Now, the environment itself is built with a combination of custom assets and asset packs and megascans. So I had some asset packs that I'd gotten presumably through the free monthly marketplace giveaways, or just other always free asset packs. And there's a few of them in here. I threw a whole bunch of different relevant projects together and asset packs together, and built my environment, and then just migrated all of the content that I wanted to keep to bring the file size down. And it ended up being a few assets from this pack, a few assets from another pack, and a whole lot of stuff that was made custom, or at least modified, or just sort of bashed together from a bunch of different assets. So, for example, we've got this facade here, which was from one asset pack, and comes with a series of these cube map interiors, grant the illusion of being able to see inside. And I took that and made a whole bunch of custom skyscrapers and a custom material which could also take those cube maps but onto windows, or as displayed through windows, that would be consistent no matter the size of the building, and have these like like these blinds blocking out some of them to create a little bit more variety, and a separate material which I could change out for the rest of the facade. It also actually is set up to drop the cube map and replace it with just white at a certain distance, so that the objects that are right in the background that you will never be able to see that sort of detail on are cheaper to render. You have to be incredibly efficient with these environments, because whilst the computers at the theatre are quite powerful, we have to be mindful of performance still. It is still a real-time environment. It's being rendered every frame. So all of my lighting for this is baked because I didn't have any real dynamics going on. I didn't have any lights that needed to move. It was a fairly static environment. And it's just very emissive. Also baked a lot of reflections, because there's a few reflective surfaces, and I've got a lot of global illumination and stuff. The rooftop itself is just a bunch of planes. So just these tiles of Megascans concrete that I just dressed with a lot of clutter and decals to add sort of grime and dirt, and a few custom assets and a few sourced assets just to make it look more complete. I wanted the skyline to be loosely cyberpunk, but quite drab, but still have that color. So I made a lot of skyscraper models and sort of kit bashed some assets onto them to make the illusions of antenna and stuff like that, and then put these strips of lights along them that were just different colors, just to give the skyline sort of some variety. And then over the top of that, superimposed some billboards and these slum assets just to show that like the city is being built over a little bit. We also put a bunch of little Easter eggs in the environment, so the businesses, like business billboards, are our names. So Shem's name and my name and my business name, and then we've got the character of Cola, which is a TikTok character of Meg's, who we inserted into the universe because she's like from another cyberpunk kind of universe, and so I had to I took an existing billboard asset but created a custom material for that. We found that N-Display, which is the software that's responsible for taking this from Unreal and putting it onto the screens, didn't like running movie textures, which would be the traditional sort of approach that I would want to use for something like this. So I couldn't just put the movie file in. I had to actually create a sprite sheet or a series of still images from the video and then feed them into a material in order to get this to work on the screens. So there was like a lot of trial and error that went into developing this environment and then getting it to look right on the screens. Same with color. Color was a really tough one. So there's actually a post-process, like a color grade that's being applied to this before it's even in camera. So you can see like without the color grade, just the lighting itself, it actually looks like this, which really red and drab and washed out. But the post kind of pumps it a little bit more towards blue, brings up the contrast a little bit. The downside is that things like the billboards start to get a little bit washed out, and we did find that, especially in the edit after I applied the LUT and everything, you couldn't really see the billboards very clearly, but that also kind of worked because I only really had the one detail going on, and it would have been nice to have some variety in there, but I just didn't have the time or the resources to have those varied billboards, unless I wanted to lean even more heavily into asset packs. And I was trying to minimize the use of asset packs as much as I could, which is why most of these skyscrapers are custom assets that are just being kit bashed in slightly different ways with a few other assets over the top of them to help add some variety to them, some detail to them. But you build these assets, these environments, in much the same way as you would for a game, except that you've got a single vantage point. And so you dress everything to look at its best from that spot, right? And so there's a lot more detail going on in here, a lot more focus. And if I go over the edge of the rooftop, there's obviously nothing. There's nothing under the rooftop, and all the details are towards the lower end of the buildings or where the streets would be. It's not there. There's no ground or anything, because I know that I'm never going to see it. It's never going to be visible. It's only everything above the edge of the building is going to be visible. So that's what needs all of my attention. And likewise, closer to the rooftop, the more detail. So these spots over here have a building, and then these slums, and then billboards. Whereas if I go over here, these are some asset pack meshes that are just in the far background to create an illusion of the city continuing on, there being more sprawl. There was a lot of repurposing and kit bashing that went on in this project, because it's a good way to save time. So, like with my window material, if I look at that, most of it is pulled from Megascan's own sort of default master material, but with a little bit of a modification because I'm using channel packing to make things a little bit more efficient. What that means is that rather than the shader needing to query 3 different textures here, which it would be the default, it's just asking about the one because that's got the red, green, and blue. Those channels have these textures embedded in them. So that's one little modification I made, but that is just for the window facade. And then I'm doing a little bit of scaling here, which makes the windows the same size even when I scale the object. So over here I'm using, again, just a sprite sheet to pseudo-randomly put blinds on some of the windows to create a little bit of variety. That didn't actually work out as nicely as I would have liked it to, but it did the job. And I've created a sort of fake glass effect over the top of the cube maps to actually make it look like there's a separation between the walls and the windows and make them actually look like glass. So there's a lot of taking pieces of these provided assets, either from marketplace asset packs or from Megascans, and then butting them together and creating some custom elements to try and bridge them together and to get them to do exactly what I want. So like this building is a grouping of a custom mesh that I made in Maya, which is just a really simple skyscraper, and a bunch of assets creating this kind of a lattice, kind of a frame over the outside of it. I just thought it looked cool. And these here, which are just embedded inside of the mesh, create some sort of, I don't know, cooling towers, water towers, just platforms, and a big antenna, which from a distance just makes it look a little bit more interesting than if it were just a straight up and down sort of box with windows on it. And so this is what my city actually looks like if you get out far enough. So we have the rooftop, which is conspicuously alone, floating in nothing, surrounded by a whole lot of detailed buildings kind of facing it, and then a few less detailed buildings right off in the distance to create a sense of a nearer skyline, and also to block off certain sight lines where it would have been more noticeable that the environment went into nothingness, and a few other meshes in the far background to create a sense of the world continuing on, and a few lights in the distance as well for that same reason. So part of designing everything from this one viewpoint was that I had the freedom to kind of move buildings around to block out certain things. So some of these buildings are mostly here because if they weren't, the world would look too empty. So this is going to leave its bits and pieces behind. But so like this one, I would have had to have maybe moved another one of these over there, or something to get that skyline to continue on. I probably could have done both.
I was candid entirely that time. You didn't get me to repeat anything, so that was entirely candid. Hi, I'm Shem. I am one of the choreographers and character designers for the Cyberfight.
How did we approach putting the choreography together for this?
So when we put together the choreography, the first thing we had to think about was time constraints. Chatting with you about how long do we want this to be? We don't want it to get too technical. Let's keep it all manageable. It was then just breaking it down into going, all right, let's just segment it down to basically 3 major plot pivot points, so to speak, or sort of 3 main turn of the tide fights, and then just sort of pad out the little fights in between then to really sort of build that up so that each of those are a real sort of exclamation mark or a period point of that sentence per se.
I know for me, it was finding that balancing point between I didn't want the choreo to be too spectacular that we were going to have trouble executing it in the limited amount of time we were going to have, 1, to practice it, but 2, to shoot it, or have too much risk associated given that we were shooting in the theatre with all the screens and everything. But I also didn't want it to just be too just like wail on each other for 2 minutes. It was about finding those big cool beats and then just stringing those together for me. And so I remember when we were putting it together, my plan was that we'd go away for a bit and try to think of what big beats we wanted for our character, and then we would try to string them together. Weirdly enough, the one that I came up with initially for my character we didn't end up using in the end, because it got adapted into something slightly different, and then it ended up being something we cut on the day for time constraints. But also because it was so technical that we were worried we were going to be able to execute it effectively.
It's always better, though, to really aim up nice and high and be like, cool, this is the height we can go, but we can pull it back if need be.
The choreography did evolve a lot, even just in the early planning stages, because if you recall, we were originally going to make this a ring fight. Like, this was going to be like a prize fight sort of a deal. And that would have been quite different choreography, but then we ended up canning that fairly early on and going for just like... Our context honestly never really got that nailed down, did it? Like, there's not much of a story in this thing.
I had a few story ideas playing around in my head, but I had a bit more time to worry about sort of character creation as we were going, but we'll touch on that as we get along the subject. But yeah, it was originally then going with, all right, well, we've got a whole bunch of different scenarios. Let's just start making a few beats for what our characters can do, and then we'll adapt them to the environment, adapt them to the characters we create, and then, modify them on the day as well, depending on camera restraints. So I think you mentioned a rooftop at some point, or you started creating a rooftop scene, and we were just like, boom, yep, we're fighting on a rooftop now. And then our decision was made for us.
And that was kind of all we really had to work with most of the way through planning the choreography was, it's on a rooftop. It's vaguely cyberpunk.
Sometimes that's all you need. Sometimes you sort of find that area. I mean, I've had a few times where you sort of walk into a car park and you'd be like, all right, it's in a car park scene. We're going to do like a mild mugging, or I walk under a bridge on a stroll somewhere and I'll be like, oh, under a bridge. This is going to be like an illegal fight club sort of place. Like, you can look at the environment and definitely make a story out of that. No worries at all. So when you showed that rooftop, I think everyone was just like, all right, the story is coming to me based off this environment already. There was some beautiful inspiration from Blade Runner and Matrix and everything behind it. So we're like, yeah, we can work off that.
We did have some changes that happened on the day as well, because we shot our previs based on our story, which was based on a storyboard or like a little animatic, which was done based on, hey, we have these key beats and some quick reference that we shot of these beats that we kind of strung together. But then on the day, quickly discovered that we were not going to have enough time to shoot the entire fight. So we had to cut this big section out of the middle of it and just drop it. Which for me, I was actually kind of happy with in the end, because it incorporated the technique I was the most worried about us being able to pull off, which was that big flying armbar, because we'd had trouble with that in training. And we had some ideas on how to get around it, but it was still one I was worried we were going to need a few takes for and that it wasn't going to fully line up. And then it was followed by like my least favorite parts of the choreo that got a little bit muddy for me. The prolonged ground fight and the sort of test of strength moments that I think to really look good would have required some big camera movements that we weren't really able to do. So I actually wound up okay with that, but I was really happy with how well it managed to stitch, right? Like we're able to drop all the way from you catching my Superman punch right the way through to the slam onto the ground and getting kicked away. We just were able to drop that entire section and stitch them, and everything kind of just worked.
No, it was perfect. I mean, yeah, on one side, it's then great to make those stitches come together, like, in our own way. But I'm also, I'm always that little bit sad when we're like, oh, it would have been cool to be able to get the whole fight choreo and then be able to cut out the bits that we like. But again, I think it's a brilliant representation of if you're ever then working in that industry, you sort of rock up with the idea of this is what the stunt is going to be, or this is what the action's going to be. And then they go, all right, you've got these camera restraints, these location restraints, these performance restraints, these time restraints. And I think it's an elegant art in itself to be able to go from like, this is all the stuff we can do. And now given the constraints, we can still do all of this stuff. So it was beautiful in its own way when we looked at the time that we had to try and film all this in and what we were capable of and still managed to pull out that beautiful fight.
Yeah, I was pretty happy with how it all came together in the end. I know you seemed to get a really good grasp of who your character was pretty quickly.
Well, when I was creating my character, I got very lucky when you showed the environment, I think, to me first. So from then, it was just being like, all right, who is someone that would live in this circumstance? And then I know I've been playing with a lot of character development things recently from a number of avenues. And so I was just applying all those techniques to this basically, and then going, all right, who would live in the area? Why is he after you? Like, what is he going to get out of this? Asking all those questions sort of makes a character. Even though we didn't have a lot of time to do it, it was just a fun little exercise and being like, all right, let's build this character and give him like, how would he move? Does he have any sort of defining things that hint at his background and such like that? So yeah, the characters, I get carried away with characters quite a bit. Because then I think I was poking you all the time, being like, so what's your character? What's our relationship? Why are we fighting? What are we doing here?
Yeah, to which my answer was usually,
It's like, you're really like, I am swamped with every aspect of this. Your time was a lot less, so.
It wasn't even just a lot less. I'm not much of a writer. That's something that I do struggle with. And I'm not that great with preparing for stuff like this. I remember in high school, my theatre teacher once giving me somewhat of a backhanded compliment of what I lack in sort of preparation, I make up for in resourcefulness. I'm very much one of these people who will wing things and adapt and improvise. And we were doing that with my character the whole way, even just to down to the costume. Like I got the final pieces of the costume the week of shooting after we found that most of the stuff I was leaning towards was too similar to what you were going for as well.
Well, I think we had that entertaining day where we were like, let's look at our costumes. So I brought my stuff over and we ended up walking into the room wearing pretty much the exact same thing. We're like, all right, one of us is going to have to change. And then ironically, we both changed. So
yes, yeah, because you pushed it a little bit more in the suit direction.
Yes, I think you'd mentioned that at the start of this, the character, imagining him a bit sort of suity, but sort of going, I'm not sure how it would sort of into that sort of cyberpunk thing, but eventually I stumbled across something that worked quite well and was a nice homage to the Matrix.
Yeah, I was a little bit concerned when I first saw your final costume that it was actually going to work, because it looked a little bit too suit and tie kind of aesthetic, like you'd gone a little bit too far to every day, I guess, with it. But once we actually got the lights and the makeup and everything on it, it was just like, yes.
have been sort of much fun to embellish, make it sort of futuristic, because I looked over a few things on the net, but at the same time, I didn't have tailoring experience to be able to recreate that suit into something else entirely.
Yeah, we did somewhat suffer from not having like experienced production designers or hair and makeup kind of deal going on. That was very improvised and cobbled together and borrowed.
Yeah, I did my makeup myself, which is never recommended, but hey.
Yeah, the DOP and assistant director were doing my hair as we were shooting. Yeah, I know with my character, pretty much on the day, we ended up deciding, largely because it was really hot in the volume, to just use my sort of under protection as the costume.
Yeah.
Which in the end kind of worked. So like this motocross gear that is supposed to be to protect me underneath my clothes when we do stunts just became like some sort of combat vest instead.
It is so good when that works though, because then you're like, all my padding is just there, so no hiding.
But rather than that and then a shirt and then a jacket, which was the previous idea where I was absolutely cooking to death. And I don't think it looked as good anyway. Right? Like it didn't look as good as just the vest anyway. So that kind of just worked out. But then my hair also became like an integral part of the character over the course of the piece as well. Like I didn't know what to do with my hair when we went to shoot this. Like I was originally going to do some wild undercut dyed thing to get full cyberpunk with it. But then I might have another shoot coming up which required my long hair, so I couldn't do it.
That's why I suddenly learned why people charge so much to get their hair cut. It might cost you other roles.
Yeah. So I just tied my hair up, and then it started working its way out as we were shooting, and it was just like, nah, we're going with that. We're just going to make it look like it's getting more and more disheveled. So we were like deliberately wetting it and making it look more disheveled. We lent into it.
But it's amazing. It's those little quirks that you figure out along the way that then you go like, oh, this is what engages people with the character that little bit more. Because if you just have that one character with the gelled back hair and they look exactly the same at the end as they did at the start, it's just, I don't know, it sort of steps back from reality slightly.
So how did you come up with all that UV stuff? What was the inspiration for that?
Well, I think it was from when we started talking about it as like a cyberpunk style theming. And, you know, it was ironically at the same time as when all the that cyberpunk game was coming out, that thankfully there was all this inspiration splattered everywhere. But one of the major things I was thinking of as a villain was that I'm going to be someone who's a bit more soulless, because, you know, a human you'd almost be able to talk to and reason with, but I wanted to be someone who was a bit more sort of just cold and logical, and that sort of stems in the way of cybernetics and implants and stuff like that. So I basically took it on the idea of going like, yeah, let's try some like contact lenses and sort of see where they go. And I sort of had to Google around with them and found a beautiful range of contact UV lenses. So I was like, brilliant, I'm going to go with that sort of light blue. And then I'll add in a few more sort of like streaks to sort of give the sort of cybernetic lines around the face and such like that. When I was playing with the UV as well, I was then thinking about my character and going like, all right, so why is he after you? Is he just cold and logical and has no emotion, or is he a bit sort of angry? So I started making him actually very frustrated at humanity. He became this bounty hunter because he just actually really gets frustrated at humans. He actually kind of hates them, but mostly because he's actually jealous of their own humanity. Because, you know, he's just as a robot, he doesn't sort of get to feel anything as extreme as what the humans do. I try to subtly portray that a bit more by having a lot of his lines all sort of coming down out of his eyes as though they're like actually tears. But I didn't want to point that out too much because I was like, man, that's so emo and so edgy. But thankfully, they're also really good places to just run cybernetic lines over a face. They're very iconic. Thankfully, we were working with someone who was also very skilled in the use of UV paint and UV artistic creation. And so they lended a bit of their materials and expertise, which was an absolute blessing for that, because I had no prior skill in painting on my own face, and it even took me about half an hour to put my contacts in the first time because I've never really worn contacts before.
It also created an interesting piece of like almost extended universe because, of course, Meg lending us the character of Cola for the billboards, and using a lot of the same UV resources, the contacts and everything that you were using. It's subtle, but I feel like that's a really nice little connecting the universe and making it a little bit more complete.
No, I love that with the hints that there's more universe out there. Even when it's something as short as like, oh, here's a little 2-minute fight, there's actually like a bit of story behind all the things happening. Like the fact that we have a billboard character who is a major player in some other aspects on the internet, then like, oh, okay, like you can start tying that stuff through a little bit later on as well, depending on if this becomes a project that you're like, I actually really liked this environment. Let's keep playing with this. Meg was epic.
I guess we'll just hit it all together. The other aspects of the production design, like we were trying to make the set look like a rundown rooftop. So there was a lot of like extending our environment that we needed to be able to perform on as well into the digital sets. So we have like these 40mm EVA foam mats topped with these 8mm rubber mats, which I painted to as best I could to get them to look like concrete.
Looked very cool. I mean, often on the top of roof, it isn't sort of concrete stuff. It is that weird sort of poorly placed rubber matting in that. So I actually found that worked beautifully from my experience on rooftops.
And it wasn't the worst surface to hit in that regard as well. Like the rubber's obviously worse than the EVA foam, but like it was not so bad.
Look, I attempted a couple of wrecks, and for my wrecks, I was like, this is so comfy. It was, often those sorts of mats and that are a little bit harder to hide, but the fact that we can incorporate them directly into our environment meant that I could have happily thrown so many of my massive wrecks and still come out quite happy. So it was just, I was like, this is great. Oh my God, I can fall on these all day.
It comes back to that thing of it's really useful having like stunties as part of like your production design, I guess, in that regard of like making sure that you can try and build the sets to incorporate the stunts, because then your actors are safer, but also you don't have to mess around quite as much. If you put that work in, you don't have to mess around quite as much with mats and stuff. Like we did have a crash mat that we used for the big wrecks to shoot around, but we didn't need it for most stuff. We were fine with the foam and the rubber, and we were able to keep doing takes. Like it was only a 1-day shoot, but we were able to keep doing takes.
Yeah. I think my biggest wreck was just a header, which is just me throwing myself from like standing onto my back. But because of those mats, we had that double layer of rubber mats. When I first did it, I was like, wow, I can give you a happy 20, 30 takes on this. You just tell me when you got the shot that you've liked. Because you do that to concrete. Concrete is very unforgiving, and although we have techniques to help mitigate the impact, the techniques can pale pretty easily in comparison to actual just comfy padded rubber mats. But yeah, the fact that we had people with experience who have done fighting such like that you can build that directly into your environment, as you were saying, just it saves a lot of messing around and then figuring out where to try and make things work when you can just be like, this is where we're going to do a wreck. If we can have something built into there, easy as.
I did have one painful wreck on the day, if you remember, when you were flinging me with your foot while I was launching myself to make it look like you really booted me. And I spiral around in the air and I land on my arm, on my chest, and my arm goes in between my pads on my chest piece. And I land with all my weight on my arm. Doesn't hurt my arm, hurt my chest. And I spent the whole day feeling like I had like a bruised rib. And that was right near the start of the day as well. So I had to go through the whole day with that. And I was feeling that for 3 or 4 days. It was just sheer bad luck though. Like it didn't matter how much padding we had. Like everything just lined up for me to land in just the wrong way.
Oh, you can have all the padding underneath you, but the padding between all your knuckles and your sternum, that's a bit of a different padding.
Exactly. So that wasn't fun. Working with the props was another interesting one. So like we had the fake bar and the fake gun. And so with the bar, in the end I was still not completely happy with the way that sold. Just because I don't think we got enough takes of it. We were playing with too many things in terms of character and angle and reaction, like how we wanted to react to it and stuff like that. And I think in the end we just didn't get enough takes to find the best ones. I think to find the best response to that.
Oh, that was one of those shots where I was really feeling like we needed that camera to almost pan along with it to be able to really sell it, but technological limitations meant that wasn't an option for us.
Yeah.
So we were trapped between a rock and a hard place with that choreography. And I think in the end it became one of those things where it was a bit too hard to sell, but it just became a bit of a story progression sort of cut. Where it was like we could eventually have done that shot better, but it's all right because it still sort of explains how we then got to that next part of the journey.
I don't think it stands out as a particularly bad shot because I was able to drop some frames and ramp some stuff to make it feel a little bit more punchy. But there was a lot of work I had to do with those shots in the edit to try and get them there that I wish I hadn't had to do. This is the problem of only having a day to shoot. The gun was interesting as well. So my biggest gripe with the gun was that opening shot with your big Mailleur de Compass disarm, which is one of those things that's awesome in theory, but really hard to sell.
Yeah, especially when we had constraints on camera angles for that.
Yeah, I didn't find the camera angle was what ruined it. I think it was actually just during our previs when we exploded a prop.
We should have just filmed that one.
Which thankfully was just some like really cheap plastic toy gun that I had that we were working with. But it got actually kicked and exploded, which would have been a great take because it was all lined up and all synced up. But because we knew that with this prop gun it needed to survive because it needed to be a major moment at the end, we were playing pretty gentle with it, and we were having so much trouble getting your kick to be in line with the gun and my cell to be in time with your kick. Again, kind of got there using some frame drops, which hide the fact that you actually miss pretty massively in the take that I used. Because I used the take that synced up best with me throwing the gun, and then I just dropped the frame where you would have hit because you were probably a good 2 feet above the gun.
Would have been, it's like, all right, let's get in some technical wizardry because, it's always the hope that you can just line it up on the day, but then when everything just goes, we'll just do it in post, it'll be fine. That's probably half a day's worth of work. I think we were rather squished with that shot as well because I was trying to get that kick right. And I'm not sure what happened that it didn't end up selling it. I think it was having a hard time trying to figure out where the camera was going to be angled and then trying to keep it far enough away from the wall that we were still selling the background.
It was also like just the distance that you had to be from me to make the angle work, I think, as well. Like you were a bit too close. And so you were kicking a little high for safety, I think. Because I think you also didn't want to kick the gun again. We were so focused on protecting that prop that it kind of hurt us. Especially because I think early on in the shoot we were still aiming to use the gimmick in that. So as part of the prop, I'd wired in a torch to try and get some fake muzzle flash, just to try and get some of the muzzle flash in camera. At least in terms of lighting up the prop, because it would show through some of the plastic, make it look like it's hot. But ideally to get some light cast on you during that last shot. Didn't end up bothering with it. The torch stopped working towards the end anyway because it was loosely hot glued in there. But also it just wasn't really working on camera anyway, so we just didn't care. But I think early in the day we were worried about messing that up as well because it was quite fragile in how it was attached.
Speaking of lighting, it's just reminding me of all the UV makeup that I put on. Although it looked awesome, meant that we had to follow me around with a massive UV light that was probably about 2 or 3 feet long, like directly over the camera wherever we could get in without making it bounce off everything else.
Yes, without getting too much of it on everything else, especially not on the camera. Oh, I hated that UV light because I hate getting UV light like in my eyes.
Oh, I should have seen it from my perspective. Like on the plus side, wow, it looked great. I still look back over and be like, damn it, that's my peak career right there. Everything's downhill from here. But yeah, I definitely felt a bit bad that I had such a complication on the day.
But I remember just on our test shoot day, testing that last shot of you laying there and being not dead, and just everybody just being like that was our moment.
We did it. We're like, cool. Even if nothing else works, that end shot will sell it all. I do love it when you get those defining moments of just that one shot works, and you're like, yep, cool. We're gonna make this work. Everything's going to come together.
And I mean, there's other shots throughout there where your UV makeup's fully lit up that are like, whoa. And so many people I've shown it to have figured that was done in post as well. Where it's like, nah, I wouldn't even know how to do that in post.
That's pretty unique looking back over some of it. And you just look at it and just go, it doesn't look, real. It almost looks like a cheesy effect. Until you realize, there is no post done on that. That was literally what I looked like on the day. And the same with you, when you had like some awesome like red and blue lights and all the hair down in front and it was all wet from after all that effort, and it was looking really epic and you're looking really like, oh, how am I going to get out of this? And that like hero shot of you was just so iconic. It then just played into that perfect sort of variation of it, of this, cyborg guy, and thankfully all my makeup had stayed on perfectly. And then it was over to you and you're looking wrecked and haggard and just classically handsome still. So, everyone likes a hero that's going through the washer. So we've only seen the edit without music currently, and I reckon once we get in some sound effects of a few of those hits, it's definitely going to sell it up a lot more, because you watch so many movies where they don't have the effects in and it looks really cheesy, but the moment you get those effects in, you're suddenly like, the mind just creates that extra bridge and it just adds that whole everything.
Oh, 100%. I found that even just doing a test cut of our test shoot, right? And getting like the shot where you like bicep curl me up and punch me in the face, which I actually did like that shot. That was from that was from the sequence that we cut, and I did like that moment.
It was such a beautifully defined moment where you think you've got me, and then I'm just like, nope, I'm a cyborg. I can lift you with one arm. Bang, bang. I was like, damn, I wanted to do that double face punch.
I did like that shot. Yeah, that sold much better once I put a little bit of sound on it, and I'm very much not a sound engineer. I wouldn't even really call myself an editor, and I'm just chucking some quick Foley like free sounds on that made that really punchy. So I am very, very excited to see what Aaron does with the sound, because as of shooting this, we haven't done sound yet.
Oh yeah, but every time we've seen like you putting up that next edit, it's just been slowly ramping up, being like, oh, see the rough cut, that looks really cool. All right, the actual edited cut, that's really cool. All right, all the things where all the punches are actually ramped up, that's looking amazing. All the bits where it's actually that little bit of a shake every time there's a punch, like every little step is just really just building it into, something that you're going to be super proud of. Did we end up having a solution to those screens distorted for future shoots?
A lot of it was just you and I getting too close to the screens. And so because you and I were so close to the screens, the focus ended up too close to the screens. We needed to move our set a little bit further away. It was worst in a couple of shots where you get knocked back towards the screens. So where I kick you off of me and where I smack you in the head with the bar were two of the worst shots for it. And it's because you stagger back towards the screens, right? And then the focus gets pulled to you, and then the screens are too close to focus. So it was just that we needed to move our action further away. That was it.
I'm sorry, it was all my fault.
No, I was responsible for that aspect of the direction, and so it was my fault. I think I got most of it to a point where you need to be looking for it. So like, I will notice it every time. People who understand virtual production, shooting on lead wall, will probably notice it straight away.
The real test will then, when it gets released to the public and they don't have the background of us and all the knowledge of what we went through going through it. Thankfully, on the bright side, all of this was a big test for you. So the fact that we could create this out of a test shoot is phenomenal. We created a bit of a universe. We found and then improvised around a whole bunch of technical problems. We managed to make a fight scene, which is often really hard to do because it's always quick cuts and camera pans. This was the perfect learning experience. Basically, what it all comes down to was I know this was originally just set up by you to be just a test experience. And the fact that we could make it into that little universe that we did just blew my mind. And even though I know it's not going to come out as perfect as we wanted, because, you walk into it with visions of grandeur, but the fact that we still managed to create that despite coming across all these limitations, such as, the actual environment, the fact we could only do this fight on a 3x3 meter space against a wall, like a big technological wall that we hadn't really worked with before, using a camera that we couldn't move, having to constantly rotate ourselves because we only had the screen on one side.
And that was actually a really fun aspect, was maintaining that continuity. So whenever we wanted to do a reverse, you and I having to trade places and then have the world move around us, and then have the lights swap sides, but then not be on the back screen either, because they didn't want to be in the shot.
It was a surreal experience, very surreal to be able to sort of stand there and go, all right, so we need to pivot the world, just rotate everything 180 degrees. So we'll take our new spots, and then watching the whole world around us just revolve around us. Just going we're the center of this universe. All right. I am hoping that in future they will be able to sort of actually have those screens butted up against each other, because that was a massive limitation, the fact that we had edges to those screens.
So we are probably going to be limited to just that one screen in the position that it's in going forward. But I think a lot of it will just come down to knowing how to shoot against it. And so the more things we shoot, the more we'll learn how to shoot against it, rather than changing the setup too drastically. I don't think that that's the solution, because that will create a whole mess of other issues as well.
So on set, I essentially just controlled the entire scene, rotating the level, controlling the light cards to give the lighting, and that's what I did. Doesn't seem so advanced. Well, so the light cards we have here, you can control the transparency of them, which is the brightness. And then you can control the colors of them and positioning. There it is. Lower the brightness of it and change the color to whatever color we want. In the shoot we used a lot of red and blue. rotating the actor, which is the camera that is capturing the environment, is pretty straightforward as well. Just clicking on it and then rotating it like so. And you can change the positioning as well, move around in the world, up and down, sideways. You can do whatever you want with it. And then anytime you actually rotate or change the positioning, you have to change the rotation of the light cards as well and positioning on them so that they fit the continuity of the shots you've filmed so far. And that's what I did on set. So on shoot day, we did not use the HTML controller, which with that you could do anything that I did here at the computer in Unreal, changing the light cards and rotating and changing position of the world. We didn't end up using that because it's not 100% yet, so it's a bit unreliable. But in the future, we want it to be 100% so that the DOP can control everything themselves from an iPad instead of having someone sit on the computer controlling it. On the on-shoot day, we had an issue with the fulcrum not working properly.
And what is that?
And the fulcrum is it tracks so that it's in front of the camera constantly, and it makes it look. It gives the scene the realistic depth that you have in real world when you're filming. And perspective, yes, you get the proper perspective. And when you're moving around in this volume with the camera, you need that perspective to change. But that was actually not working properly, so it was reversed. So we ended up not using it. And since our camera is static when we're filming, it ended up working fine with just rotating the world and changing the positioning so that it lined up with the shots and the camera positioning.
So when we're shooting, we to try and avoid kind of the artifacts and stuff that you get from shooting against a screen, which we're seeing plenty of in that camera, you need a very particular type of camera with all the right sort of settings, but also you generally want to try and make sure that you've got plenty of distance between you and the camera, and then also plenty of distance between where you've got focus, so on the actors, and the screens. So you want to have a fairly short focal depth, and you don't want to get the screens in focus, because that's when you'll really notice them. If they're just sitting as sort of a slightly out of focus backdrop, you don't get the same amount of artifacts. You do still have to do a little bit of post though, like it doesn't get rid of needing to do any post-processing. You still need to clean up things afterwards a little bit, hide where the screens start and end, or maybe get rid of a little bit of splash. We did have some problems I had to clean up in the edit where the light cards, which were over sort of out of shot, were casting light onto the rear screen. So you need to sort of clean up things like that. But all in all, like the ability to be able to control the lighting of the set, and with kind of the constant ambient of the actual environment, act to the environment, tweak your lighting to that sort of degree that we can, was kind of worth that. I guess we could just start with like, how do you feel like the shoot went in general?
Pretty well, I think. I think for what it is, like running it as a small shoot worked really well. It's like a small crew shoot because there's so many different parts of trying to get something like that working, and it's a very warm space with those LED screens going. So once we got those going, but having everyone there who was there was just great because they were 110% on top of everything. So it runs really nice and smoothly when everyone knows what they're doing and works together.
Cool. What did you find were the biggest challenges on the shoot?
The biggest challenges, I think, because we had so much of the space we couldn't shoot onto, because we had, here's the background and here's where the screens end and here's where the mats end. that was a challenge, trying to make sure we still got the scope of all the action that was happening and the stunts that, you know, everyone's worked so hard on. We wanted to capture those as well as we could, whilst also not breaking the illusion that we're in this special space. I think that was probably the biggest challenge. Basically, you know, we got into the space, and the space had modeled, we'd obviously done some practice runs with it before, so we knew exactly what we were kind of going into. One of the best things about shooting with this technology is the fact we didn't really need to set up any lights, because there was lights that we could use with the screens to bring in and add extra lights into the fill in the space to sell it that we were in this environment. Having that control was really great. Having someone there to operate the system, so because we're constantly having to flip the background to make it sell for what we're doing, having someone there specifically operating that was really great. And yeah, it was definitely a learning experience. I'm very keen to do it again, but I'm really happy with how it turned out. It looks like a bit like a video game, which I think was the aesthetic we were going for, and so being able to achieve that was really exciting. I think the hardest thing was the heat of the space, and shooting handheld in a very hot environment is extremely physically taxing. And it was a very small crew. Working with a small crew both has its perks and its downsides. And the good things was that we knew exactly what everyone was doing at one time. The downside was that everyone had more to do because the crew was so small. But I wouldn't have wanted any more people in that hot space, because it would have made it worse. But yeah, I think that was the hardest thing for the shoot, just how physically taxing it was, because of the heat and the handheld. Oh god, I think the biggest technical limitation was the fact that we hadn't gotten to play with the camera properly before the shoot, and so when we went for the test shoot, well, that was why we had a test shoot, was we hadn't used that camera before, and so when it came down to it, it was like, oh, we can't get this lens on this camera, and it turns out there was a Metabones in there in a different box. We just hadn't realised. That was embarrassing. But thankfully, that's why you do test shoots. So thankfully, when we got to the actual shoot, everything was running pretty smoothly. We were able to set the camera up pretty quickly and get things running. I think on the day, everything ran pretty smoothly. It's a bit of a blur to me, honestly. Like, the day is a bit of a blur. I think we overestimated how much we could get done in a day. So there was a fair bit of culling action on the day to get through it, because stunt stuff does take so much longer than actual filming. Not actual filming, like they're both actual filming, but filming dialogue. That we kicked off, we were going relatively, slowly, and then realized pretty quickly we are not going to get everything done if we continue at this pace. And so we had to be pretty flexible about what we were shooting, how we were shooting it, how much of the scene we were going to include. But thankfully everyone was pretty able to roll with the punches, and it works, the scene works, it still looks dope, so that's cool.
Mm-hmm. I know for me, I was really disappointed that our tracker wasn't working properly on the day.
That was hard, and wasn't really much we could do about that. It was just like, okay, we'll just make it work with what we've got then.
Having Oscar there mitigated that, because we were able to fake some of the perspective, as long as we kept the camera static.
Yeah.
But we would have been able to do some far more creative shots had the tracker been working on the day. Yeah,
that's hard, but
we adapted.
Adapt, overcome, fucking whatever the rest of that. So I have a character that's I play in some online collaborative storytelling projects. Her name is Cola St. Pims, and she is a songstress. And she's a terrible person. And she cameos in the background of our scene in this. She's on all the billboards because, she's a popular songstress in the world that I play her in. And so that was really fun for her to be able to be there and be in the background there. That was really, really fun.
I actually just had a crash which lost me about an hour or two of this masking work that I'm going to have to go back and do. So, save often, kids. So I've encountered a few problems while I've been doing the edit. The first was that because we only had a day to shoot, we had to move pretty fast, so we don't have a whole lot of takes of certain shots, and so I've had to kind of just pick the best ones at the best angles that we managed to get a little bit, and then try and mitigate some of the performance problems with like some frame drops and some ramping and stuff like that, which probably would have done anyway to try and get things to be a bit snappier, but I've had to not just use it to enhance the performance, but actually use it to resolve some issues in the performance in certain shots. And that's worked out actually pretty nicely. I think that that's been okay, but it was a problem that I've had to edit around. The other is that, and this one's a little bit of a bigger problem, there are issues in terms of the volume. The first is color and light from the surrounding screens splashing onto the main screen, which I've had to removing kind of the color grade, go in and mask out sections of the background and pull mainly our key lights that we were using out. So red splashing onto the back wall particularly in such a way that it's obviously not on the environment, it's on the screen. And then I've had to take that red out of it. The other is that at various points, Shem and I got too close to the screens. And so focus was too close to the screens. And we started to get some artifacts. And that one's a little bit of a bigger problem to solve because I've had to go in and actually mask around Shem and I and apply a subtle blur onto the screens in order to take out the moire. And in some other shots where we've tilted the camera and gotten some banding, I've had to go in and actually paint over where that banding is and apply a slightly stronger blur. And in some cases both in the same shot. So that's taking me a lot of time. I'm having to go through fairly frame by frame, which I guess just tells us that we very much have to be careful about the performance distances from the screens and the strength, I suppose, of the lighting. Those are the main things that we need to take away from this based on the problems that I've encountered in the edit. But they're also not the most insurmountable problems. Like they are things that can be corrected in the edit. They just take a lot of time to do so.